Our history has now reached the decade of 1960. This was a very turbulent decade, and a decade filled with many cultural changes within the United States. At the beginning of this decade, in 1961, John F. Kennedy became president. He was from a very wealthy and politically active family, and he was a hero from World War II. And at the age of 43, he was one of the youngest presidents in the history of the United States. And one of the things that he did as president was that in 1963, he signed into law the Community Mental Health Center Act. On the screen is a picture of him signing this law, surrounded by several white men and one white woman. Now, recall that antipsychotic medication had been developed during the previous decade, and this led to an exodus from asylums. And so the plan for this new law was that it would provide funding for community mental health centers, and these centers would provide outpatient care to people with mental disorders. The idea was that this care would include both medication and psychotherapy, and the goal was to drastically reduce the number of people kept in asylums. And although the intent was good, the program never really received adequate funding. So in retrospect, it seems this law probably, on one hand, did contribute to the reduction of asylums, but on the other hand, it simply increased the chances that someone with severe mental illness would simply become homeless. Prior to the 1960s, a large portion of people with mental illness were locked in asylums, but then after the 1960s, a large portion of people with mental illness were homeless. And during this decade, there was increased growth in the civil rights movement. It was in 1963 that Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech at a march on Washington, D.C. In this speech, he talked about his dream for a country without racism. King put together religious themes about love and justice drawn from the Christian Bible with patriotic themes drawn from the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And he proposed a type of resistance to racism that used nonviolent tactics, an approach that resisted violent racist oppression with nonviolent protest and civil disobedience. And although Martin Luther King took a nonviolent approach, and other civil rights leaders proposed much more militant ideas, still, many white people in the government viewed him as a threat to national security. The FBI was actively following him, and they had been monitoring his activities since the 1950s. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover disliked King and believed he was influenced by communists. But during King's speech, he talked about his dream, and he said, quote, "So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." And then later he concluded his speech by talking about his dream, a dream of a day when all God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last." Another important civil rights event in 1963 was the Birmingham Campaign in Birmingham, Alabama. And Martin Luther King was a key leader of this campaign, and it involved nonviolent protests that included lunch counter sit-ins and business boycotts and marches on City Hall. During the campaign, the white government authorities used violent tactics to suppress black demonstrators. For example, demonstrators were attacked with high-pressure fire hoses and attack dogs. Some images from the campaign are depicted on the screen, including a picture of Martin Luther King after he had been arrested and put in jail for his involvement in this campaign. Now, notably, at this point in history, President Kennedy had voiced some support for civil rights, but he also avoided taking any decisive action because he depended on the support from white Democratic voters in the South. So he maintained a somewhat ambivalent position between, on one hand, giving verbal support to civil rights, and on the other hand, he avoided action that would anger white voters. However, images from the Birmingham campaign, images showing white people attacking the demonstrators, these images were broadcast in the news, and these images forced Kennedy to act. This was partly because in the United States, these images created some sympathy for the protesters. But more importantly, however, these images created difficulties in foreign relations. Recall that a key concern for the United States had to do with fears about the spread of communism. At this point in history, there were several developing countries, and these countries appeared to be at risk of becoming communist. And the United States wanted to prevent these countries from developing ties with the Soviet Union. And many of these countries had largely non-white populations. So when leaders in these developing countries saw images of violent racism in the United States, they became reluctant to trust the United States, and they became more likely to trust the Soviet Union. So Kennedy needed to find some way to demonstrate that the United States could be trusted. And so what he did is he proposed the need for a civil rights bill. Now, I don't know how much Kennedy would have pushed for a civil rights bill, or if he could have gotten one to pass. This is something we will never know because on a visit to the state of Texas in 1963, Kennedy was assassinated. He was shot as his motorcade passed through the streets in downtown Dallas. A picture of the motorcade before he was shot is on the screen. And after Kennedy's assassination, his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, became president. Now, Johnson stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, and he had a domineering and persuasive interpersonal style that made him highly effective in getting politicians to support his plans. On the screen, you see a picture of Johnson leaning into the personal space of another man as they talk. And this was very typical of Johnson's style. Sometimes Johnson's tactics seemed rather crude. For example, he sometimes forced people to follow him into his office bathroom to continue conversations while he sat on his toilet to defecate. Now, whereas Kennedy had seemed ambivalent towards civil rights, Johnson framed the passage of civil rights legislation as a tribute to Kennedy, and Johnson was effective in pushing through 2 civil rights bills. First, in 1964, a Civil Rights Act was passed that prohibited racial discrimination. Then, in 1965, a Voting Rights Act was passed that specifically prohibited voter discrimination. For example, it prevented the use of the literacy tests that many states had established as a voting requirement. These were the tests that all the white people passed and all the black people failed. It also allowed federal examiners to review voter qualifications, and it made provisions for federal observers to monitor polling places. Now, notably, Johnson was a Democrat, and the passage of his civil rights legislation was a key factor in a political shift that took place in the South. Previously, the South had been solidly Democratic, and after the civil rights legislation, the South shifted and became solidly Republican. After passage of the civil rights legislation, there was somewhat of a backlash against it from many white people throughout the United States. Some of this backlash was fueled by several race discrimination riots that, coincidentally, happened to occur shortly after this legislation was passed. So these race discrimination riots were a response to many years of racism, including racist behavior by the police. And they included a series of riots in largely African American areas of several cities. One example is the Watts riot of 1965. So Watts is a black neighborhood within the city of Los Angeles. And one evening, a black man was arrested under the suspicion of intoxicated driving. And this took place near this man's home, and his mother came to the scene while he was being arrested. And then a crowd gathered, and then arguments broke out, and then somehow the situation escalated. Eventually, several black people were arrested, and this sparked further anger, and the situation escalated into a riot. The police tried to establish control, and the National Guard was called in, and the police established barricades. But crowds of black people in Watts fought, and they repelled the law enforcement officers. They threw bricks and rocks. They burned and looted businesses owned by white people in the area. And this riot lasted 6 days. On the screen is a picture of white police officers arresting a black man during the riot. One estimate is that the Watts riot resulted in 34 deaths and over $40 million in property damage. And during the riot, a helicopter was used to provide live television coverage of the riot. And many white people watching this live coverage were terrified by what they saw. They were fearful of angry black people inciting riots and committing crimes. In addition, many white people did not understand why black people would riot given that civil rights legislation had just been passed. They expected black people to be grateful for the legislation, and they saw the riots as evidence that black people were a dangerous group that needed to be suppressed with tactics to enforce law and order. The decade of 1960 was also the decade of the Vietnam War. This is a war with a long, complex history. Recall that Vietnam is the area that used to be called French Indochina. Recall that prior to World War II, it was controlled by France, and then when France was defeated by Germany, it lost control of Indochina, and the area was invaded by Japan. Also recall that after World War II, there was a revolution in China, and in 1949, communist leader Mao Zedong declared the creation of the People's Republic of China. So now in Vietnam, after World War II, France then tried to reassert its control, and France tried to establish its own government in Vietnam. However, there was a leader in Vietnam named Ho Chi Minh, who is depicted on the screen, and he wanted Vietnam to have self-rule. So Ho Chi Minh drafted a document that declared Vietnam's independence from France. And notably, although Ho Chi Minh was drawn to many communist ideas, his document drew heavily from the language used in the United States Declaration of Independence. And Ho Chi Minh then sought support from the United States to help remove French control. But he was turned down, and the United States instead recognized the French-installed government. So, Ho Chi Minh then turned to Communist Soviet Union and to Communist China for help. And with help from these communist countries, Ho Chi Minh began a war to expel the French government. And after a few years, he obtained some success. In 1954, the French withdrew, and at that point, a peace accord was set in place that established a communist government led by Ho Chi Minh in the north half of Vietnam, and a government linked to the former French regime in the south part of Vietnam. The map on the screen shows how the land was divided. Now, unfortunately, the government in South Vietnam, the government linked to the former French regime, that government was extremely corrupt. For example, the southern government had a Catholic prime minister in a country that was almost entirely Buddhist. And this prime minister held fake elections where he won more than 100% of the vote. But fearing the spread of communism, starting with President Eisenhower back in the 1950s, the United States began doing things to prop up this corrupt government in South Vietnam. And this included sending more and more military support to South Vietnam. Although the United States had been helping South Vietnam for several years, at the beginning of the 1960s, most people in the United States were probably unaware of the country of Vietnam and unaware of the events taking place there. But a key event that escalated the importance of Vietnam was something called the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. So the United States had a Navy ship called the USS Maddox, and the ship was on a secret reconnaissance mission in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam. And the ship reported that they were attacked. Now, most likely, this was actually just an error in reading the radar in choppy water. However, it was used as an excuse to escalate the situation. And President Johnson went on television and misleadingly called the attack unprovoked, and he retaliated by ordering the bombing of several military targets in North Vietnam. Johnson also obtained overwhelming support from Congress for a resolution that gave him almost unlimited power to pursue further military action in Vietnam. Now, politically, Johnson's escalation of the Vietnam War helped his ratings because it made him appear strong and measured. At the time, Johnson was up for re-election against a Republican opponent named Barry Goldwater, and Goldwater was accusing Johnson of being soft on communism. So Johnson's tough action in Vietnam effectively refuted that accusation and made Goldwater look extreme. And so Johnson easily won that election, and then afterwards, he pursued even more aggressive measures in North Vietnam, and the war escalated. It's not entirely clear what his motivation was for his continued pursuit of the war. Given the strength and determination of North Vietnam, and given that the government of South Vietnam was not popular and not functional and highly corrupt, and given the dense jungle terrain that covered much of Vietnam, there simply was not really any way that the United States could have won that war. So, on one hand, Johnson privately made statements suggesting that he knew that the war could not be won. On the other hand, he continued to escalate the war, and he lied to the American people, saying that the United States was winning the war. Maybe he thought this was necessary for political support. Maybe it was because he believed in a kind of a domino theory, a theory that a loss in Vietnam would make the United States look weak, and this would trigger a further expansion of communism that would have devastating consequences. Or maybe he simply wanted to be a great president and not blamed for losing a war. I'm not sure what his reason was, but in sum, it seems that Johnson could probably be described as a president that both did some very great things and some very terrible things. On the one hand, he pushed the passage of civil rights legislation. Yet, on the other hand, he was also responsible for escalating an unwinnable war. As the Vietnam War was escalating, there was a growing protest movement in the United States against the war. Many protests were organized by students, and they occurred on college campuses. A picture from a protest at Berkeley is depicted on the screen. Sometimes these protests involved sit-ins, and sometimes they involved students taking over administrative buildings. On campuses that had ROTC officer training buildings, sometimes protesters would attempt to set the buildings on fire. And these protests often resulted in arrests and violent confrontations. Also, in the presidential election of 1968, so this would be 4 years after Johnson defeated Goldwater, the Democratic Party at that point was split between people that supported Johnson's handling of the war and people opposed to the war. And there were major anti-war protests outside the Democratic Convention that year. And attempts to suppress these protesters led to more violent confrontations, and it led to chaos at the convention. And at the end of this decade, at Kent State University in Ohio, 4 students were shot and killed by the National Guard who were sent there to stop a protest. And some of the students killed were protesters, and some were merely bystanders. A scene from the Kent State shooting is depicted on the screen. Also at that time, there was an event called the Hard Hat Riot. And here, that was where a group of about 200 construction workers in New York attacked a group of about 1,000 protesters. And the construction workers broke through a police line, and they beat the protesters with hard hats and clubs, and they kicked them with steel-toed boots. One person who became identified with this counterculture was a clinical psychologist named Timothy Leary, and he's depicted in the picture at the top right of the screen. So Timothy Leary was a clinical psychologist, and he was a lecturer at Harvard University, and he did research on the effects of LSD and hallucinogens. Eventually, he started promoting the use of LSD and other drugs, and eventually he was fired from Harvard. And so afterward, he became somewhat of a renowned figure within this counterculture. He was famous for saying, "Turn on, tune in, and drop out." Also, in 1969, there was a massive 3-day music festival held on a large dairy farm in Woodstock, New York. The other pictures on the screen are pictures of Woodstock. This festival included many of the current and upcoming rock stars of this counterculture. It included groups like Santana and Janis Joplin and The Who and Jefferson Airplane and Jimi Hendrix. And given that the site for this festival was not prepared to handle the crowds of about 400,000 people that showed up, it's somewhat amazing that it was pulled off without any catastrophic events. The decade of 1960 was also a decade of assassinations. So John Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and then Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965. So Malcolm X was a key figure in the civil rights movement. He converted to Islam and joined a group called the Nation of Islam, which was a black nationalist movement. And in contrast to Martin Luther King, who proclaimed a type of nonviolent resistance to racism, Malcolm X believed it was appropriate to fight white supremacy with violence if necessary. And then in 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. And also in 1968, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And Robert Kennedy, he was President Kennedy's younger brother, and he was opposed to the Vietnam War, and he had decided to run for president. And he was doing well in the Democratic primaries and had a good chance of getting elected. However, after a campaign event at a hotel in Los Angeles, he was shot and killed. So the Kennedy family lost two brothers to assassination during the decade of 1960. Notably, these brothers had 7 other siblings, and that included another brother who was killed during World War II. And they also had a sister with mental health problems who was given a lobotomy, and her lobotomy left her incapacitated, and she was institutionalized for the rest of her life. So several of the Kennedy siblings all had tragic outcomes. So the year that Robert Kennedy was shot while campaigning for president was the same year when there were protests and violent confrontations and chaos at the Democratic primary. In the end, the Democrats nominated Hubert Humphrey, who was President Johnson's vice president. But Humphrey lost the election to the Republican Richard Nixon. Now, Nixon might be most remembered for his eventual association with Watergate, which occurred later during his next campaign for re-election during the 1970s. That was when Nixon allowed some people associated with his campaign to cover up some of their illegal campaign activity, and he was eventually forced to resign. However, Nixon's political tactics during the 1960s might be even more concerning than Watergate. As Nixon was campaigning for president, the United States was trying to arrange peace talks between North and South Vietnam in an effort to end the war. However, Nixon secretly sabotaged those peace talks. He contacted leaders of South Vietnam and told them that if they resisted the peace talks now, he would give them more support and they could get a better deal after he was elected. Because Nixon knew that if the Democratic administration were able to end the Vietnam War, that would produce extensive support for the Democratic nominee, Hubert Humphrey, and it would greatly reduce Nixon's chances of winning. So Nixon did not want the war to end before the election. It's impossible to know what would have happened if Nixon had not sought to sabotage the peace talks. But the peace talks did fail, and consequently the war continued for several more years. Now, in campaigning, Nixon also capitalized on the backlash reaction that was occurring among white people in response to the race discrimination riots. And he capitalized on the backlash against the hippies and against the counterculture and against the anti-war protests. In addition, Nixon devised a political campaign strategy that would ensure support from Southern states and that would support racism without appearing overtly racist. In this way, he could appeal both to white people that were overtly racist and also to white people that maintained some racist fears or ideas, but who did not want to be labeled as racist. For example, one of his themes in his campaign was law and order. So this allowed white people to talk about their concerns about crime without having to say that they were primarily afraid of black people committing those crimes, and without having to acknowledge that laws would be enforced in a way that would disproportionately arrest black people as criminals. According to John Ehrlichman, this was a deliberate strategy. So John Ehrlichman was one of Nixon's campaign aides. He worked closely with Nixon throughout the 1960s. He became White House counsel when Nixon was elected, and eventually he would become a key figure in the Watergate scandal. Later, in the 1980s, he wrote a book called Witness to Power, and Ehrlichman described how Nixon took strong positions on issues such as busing and quotas and crime. And Ehrlichman describes it this way. He says that Nixon took these positions, but he, quote, always couched his views in such a way that a citizen could avoid admitting to himself that he was attracted by a racist appeal. There were, for example, plausible reasons to be against open housing that had nothing to do with the fact that most public housing project dwellers were minorities. So this would begin a history of politicians campaigning on issues that were fueled by racism, but talking about these issues in a way that avoided directly mentioning race. And this allowed them to deny they were pursuing a racist agenda. During the decade of 1960, there were several studies that would go on to become classic psychology studies. One of these, in 1961, was a study conducted by Stanley Milgram. He conducted a famous study on obedience to authority. So Milgram wanted to understand the extent to which people were inclined to comply when they were given instructions to do something by a person in a position of authority. In this study, participants were led to believe that they were assisting in a study of learning. An experimenter dressed in a white lab coat instructed participants to flick switches on a machine, and they were led to believe that the machine was delivering painful electric shocks to a man strapped to a chair in the next room. In truth, the man was an actor who was screaming out in pain, pretending to be in great distress. The picture on the screen is from the study, and it shows the man, who was actually an actor, being strapped into his chair. And in the study, the experimenter, he gave commanding orders instructing participants to continue delivering shocks. And what Milgram found is that many people complied with these orders. Now, in considering this study, there are a couple important observations to make. So one, this paper, on one hand, it did not specify racial identification. So I don't know if the participants were all white. They might have been. But this was a study where, again, it was another study that included only men as participants, and we know that. The original article describes the sample as, quote, 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50, obtained by a newspaper advertisement and direct mail solicitation. So, although this is not a study that people would want to be in, it is notable that the participants were all men, and that the authors saw no need to explain their decision to exclude women. This study is also another example of a study with serious ethical problems. Subjects were deceived about the purpose of the study, and they were not informed about the risks, and they were subjected to an extreme form of stress. Milgram reported that, in response to the stress, some participants began sweating or trembling or stuttering. In addition, participants learned that they were capable of harming another person. From the published report, it's not even clear that participants were debriefed. The article merely states, quote, "Procedures were taken to assure that the subject would leave the laboratory in a state of well-being. A friendly reconciliation was arranged between the subject and victim, and an effort was made to reduce any tensions that arose as a result of the experiment." This description seems rather vague, and it does not seem sufficient to ensure the well-being of the participants. So, in sum, there were several key ethical problems with this study. There was a need to demonstrate that the knowledge gained would be worth the risks, and a need to demonstrate that the knowledge gained would be sufficient to justify the use of deception, and a need to inform participants of the risks, and a need to fully debrief participants, and a need to take more substantial steps to ensure that participants are not harmed by the study. Now let's consider developments in psychotherapy during the decade of 1960. Recall that behavior therapy was a new approach to psychotherapy developed during the previous decade, and it drew from psychological theories of behaviorism, and it emphasized the need to conduct research evaluating the effectiveness of therapy. And in the decade of 1960, behavior therapy continues to grow in popularity. And in 1966, a new organization is founded called the Association for Advancement of Behavioral Therapy, or AABT. And this association would later change its name to the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, or ABCT. And today, this is the primary professional organization focusing on research related to clinical psychology. The founding members included a man named Cyril Franks, who is part of Eisnick's research group, and Joseph Wolpe, the person who developed systematic desensitization, and Arnold Lazarus, who was a member of Wolpe's research group. And this group stood in agreement with Eisnick's claim that existing, mostly psychodynamic approaches to therapy were not effective. The official mission of this new organization included 3 points. First, they were opposed to the psychodynamic model. Second, they supported the application of the scientific method to address clinical problems. And third, they valued research to evaluate the effects of therapy. And so this really further entrenched divisions between the behaviorist and the psychodynamic therapists. For the next several decades, there would be debates between people supporting the behavioral approach, advocating for the importance of research on the effects of psychotherapy, and people supporting the psychodynamic approach, who sometimes claimed that psychotherapy was more like art, and it could not be manualized, and that it could not be tested in artificial research studies, and that behaviorist approaches overly simplified patients' problems.
Sights and sounds of fear flashed upon the screens, with calls for law and order and warthog welfare queens. 5 grams would get 5 years, with prisons growing wide, and the frightening types of people were safely locked inside. Now privileged fingers press the scales with his two.
The 1960s saw the development of other new approaches to psychotherapy. And one of these new approaches was something called cognitive therapy. And the basic premise behind cognitive therapy is that there is a close connection between people's thoughts and feelings. So, if a person is experiencing negative emotions, the person might be taught to first identify his or her thinking patterns that are producing those emotions, and then learn to evaluate and change those thinking patterns. So cognitive therapy involves helping people to evaluate and change their patterns of thinking. And the first person to propose this new cognitive therapy was a man named Albert Ellis. And his specific approach to cognitive therapy was something he called rational emotive therapy. Now, like Carl Rogers, Ellis was another person who earned a PhD in clinical psychology from Columbia University in New York. Ellis actually graduated in 1947, which would have been about 15 years after Rogers. But like all clinical psychologists doing psychotherapy at that time, Ellis was trained in psychoanalytic approaches to therapy. But he started developing ideas about his cognitive approach to therapy during the 1950s. And also, around that time, Ellis also published many books on topics related to sexual freedom. Some of these books are pictured on the screen. So Ellis is someone who is very much in step with the liberal views of the counterculture that would emerge in the 1960s. And it was during the decade of 1960 that Ellis began writing books about his new cognitive approach to therapy. Again, he called it rational emotive therapy. Notably, in addition to his liberal views on sexuality, he had a reputation for swearing and using very crude language. When he gave professional talks and when he conducted psychotherapy, it was often filled with profanity. When I was an undergraduate student, I recall my advisor telling me a story of going to hear Ellis give a talk and feeling rather offended by the language that he used. In addition, initially, Ellis was clearly antagonistic toward religion. Initially, he believed that religious belief was bad for mental health. Later, however, he adopted a more tolerant stance towards religion. Another important person in the history of cognitive therapy is Aaron Beck. Although cognitive therapy has strong ties to psychology, Beck is actually a psychiatrist and not a psychologist, although he associates with psychologists and makes regular appearances at the ABCT conferences. So Beck received his medical degree from Yale Medical School in 1946, and he became a psychiatrist, and he was trained in using Freudian psychoanalytic approaches to therapy. He became interested in treating depression, and in 1961, he developed a questionnaire for assessing levels of depressive symptoms called the Beck Depression Inventory, which is a questionnaire that is still used today. Also, around that time, he began moving away from psychoanalytic ideas, and he was influenced by some of Ellis's writings, and he began developing his cognitive theory of depression. In 1967, he published a book titled The Diagnosis and Management of Depression, and this book became a foundation for the new cognitive approach to psychotherapy. Another approach to psychotherapy that was developed during this decade was something developed by a psychiatrist named Murray Bowen, and it's typically called Bowen's approach to family therapy or Bowenian family therapy. So Bowen was another psychiatrist, and he was a professor at Georgetown University Medical Center in Washington, D.C., and he specialized in treating families that had a child diagnosed with schizophrenia. Now, as an adult, Bowen experienced conflict within his own family of origin, and the process of addressing this conflict led him to develop an approach to therapy that focused on conflict within one's family of origin. This also led Bowen to believe that all therapists need to do their own family of origin work. So, if you were to receive training from a Bowen perspective, you would spend a lot of time analyzing your own family of origin. Now, one of Bowen's key ideas was something he called differentiation. Specifically, differentiation involves a process of separating oneself from one's family of origin. According to his theory, if a person fails to differentiate, the person will become fused. There will be a fusion. And he described it as a fusion with what he called an undifferentiated ego mass. So the goal was to differentiate from your family and not become fused with an undifferentiated ego mass. Bowen also talked a lot about triangles. And a triangle is just a subset of three people from a family. So a family of three people will have just one triangle. A family with more than three people will have more than one triangle. And I presume a family of two will not have any triangles. So Bowen suggested that whenever there is a triangle, an alliance will naturally form between two of its members, and this alliance will, to some extent, exclude the third member. And from this perspective, some alliances are functional and some are dysfunctional. For example, if two parents form an alliance in deciding how to discipline a child, the third person, well, that could be a functional alliance. However, if a parent and a child form an alliance together to resist the discipline imposed by another parent, that could be a dysfunctional alliance. And yet, another type of psychotherapy that was developed during the decade of 1960 was something developed by a German psychoanalyst named Fritz Perls that he called Gestalt Psychotherapy. Now, the word Gestalt is a German word for form or shape, and it is used to describe a situation where something needs to be understood holistically, the idea that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And it can be a little bit confusing because there are two completely separate traditions in psychology that both use the word Gestalt. Although my history of psychology has focused mostly on the United States, if we were to have followed developments in Germany after Wilhelm Wundt, we would have talked about something there called Gestalt psychology, which was an approach that focused on issues of sensation and perception and the ways that people perceive things holistically. And that Gestalt psychology has no connection whatsoever with Fritz Perls and his Gestalt psychology. So now Perls was from Germany, and he was trained as a psychoanalyst. But later he developed his own unique approach to therapy. And he was Jewish, and so then during World War II, he fled Germany to South Africa. And later he immigrated to the United States. And he created his own institute, and he did seminars, but he never held an academic position. And Perls' approach is one that focused on enhancing people's awareness of their emotions, and he focused on encouraging people to exist in the present moment. So his approach involved an acceptance and awareness of emotions and existing in the current moment. His approach shares some similarities to a more recent approach to therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy. Now, one of the techniques that Perls developed was something called the empty chair technique. With this technique, a client was supposed to imagine that a specific person is sitting in an empty chair, and then the client is supposed to talk to that person, expressing feelings as if the person was actually in the chair listening. And Perls is also famous for something he called his Gestalt prayer. And his prayer went like this: I do my thing and you do your thing. I am not in this world to live up to your expectations, and you are not in this world to live up to mine. You are you, and I am I. And if by chance we find each other, it's beautiful. If not, it can't be helped. Notably, Perls' ideas focused on experiencing life, on individualism, and on doing one's own thing. And it is easy to see how these ideas fit within the growing counterculture of the 1960s. now let's return to our story of Carl Rogers. We left him last in the 1940s when he was developing his new ideas for a non-directive approach to therapy and attempting to conduct research on psychotherapy process and audio recording clients without their permission, and where he had one incident of abandoning a client. So eventually, Rogers changed the name of his approach from non-directive therapy to person-centered therapy. And his approach is often classified as a humanistic approach to psychotherapy because he believed that all people have the natural capacity to grow and to reach self-actualization. So, from Rogers' perspective, the role of a therapist is not to make the client change, but rather to provide the correct type of environment that will allow the client to grow. And according to Rogers, there were three key things that a therapist needed to do to create this type of environment, the type of environment that would allow a client to grow. First, the therapist needed to be congruent with the client. And then second, the therapist needed to provide the client with unconditional positive regard. And then third, the therapist needed to show empathic understanding of the client. Now, although this approach emphasizes the importance of a therapist's interpersonal skill in the therapy room, in professional relationships outside of therapy, Rogers' interpersonal experiences seem more chaotic. So, after spending several years at University of Chicago, Rogers eventually moves to University of Wisconsin, and there he begins a long-term psychotherapy outcome study using his non-directive approach to treat psychiatric patients. This was a much more severely disabled population than the students he treated at university counseling centers. And not surprisingly, the results of his study were largely disappointing. His non-directive approach to therapy was not sufficient to produce detectable results in this population. Notably, at this time, at the University of Wisconsin, his time there included several professional conflicts. First, there were conflicts within his research team. These conflicts reached a level where, at one point, a member of his team took boxes of data from the study and hoarded them so that others could not use the data. And then when others attempted to get the data, he destroyed everything so that no one could use any of it. Also, and maybe more importantly, Rogers appeared to have significant conflicts with other faculty members at University of Wisconsin. And this escalated to the point where Rogers sent the entire faculty a 5-page angry memo outlining all his complaints about the department. So he complained about the department's, quote, fixed policies and philosophy, and said he is, quote, seriously considering separating myself from the department. He wrote, I think that my past history shows that I can tolerate a large degree of difference between my own views and the views of the department or organization with which I work. I have gradually realized, however, that there is a limit to the degree to which differences can be tolerated. And he complained that the department is, quote, deeply dedicated to a self-defeating philosophy, and that the department, quote, ignores the fact that our educational policies run directly counter to the best research on learning and creativity. And he accused the program of having, quote, little desire to re-examine what we are doing. Now, on one hand, he may have had some legitimate complaints about the department. On the other hand, writing a 5-page angry letter expressing this kind of self-righteous indignation and contempt for the department is not likely to change anyone's views. Well, maybe not too surprisingly, in 1964, Rogers left University of Wisconsin, and at this point, he actually left university life altogether. and he moved to California and worked for a nonprofit institute. Then, after a few years there, he became frustrated with that institute, thinking it was too formalized and rigid, and so Carl Rogers made an abrupt exit to form his own nonprofit program called Center for Studies of the Person. And there, his work shifted from person-centered therapy to focusing on the idea of encounter groups. These groups were a kind of group therapy based on the principles of person-centered therapy, where a group of people would encounter each other and be genuine and authentic and real with each other. On the screen is a picture of Rogers leading an encounter group. Eventually, he promoted encounter groups as having a wide range of uses. He thought encounter groups could be used to resolve many types of human conflict, and he even proposed the idea of using encounter groups with world leaders as a method for increasing world peace. Note that the idea of encounter groups is also the type of thing that fit well within the counterculture of the 1960s. One theme in the life of Carl Rogers is that he was certainly a complex person, and sometimes it is difficult to determine what motivated him or what he was thinking. Another example of this comes from a book he published titled Becoming Partners: Marriage and Its Alternatives. In this book, Rogers provided several case studies of heterosexual couples in different types of relationships, including, for example, both monogamous and non-monogamous marriages, stable and dissolving relationships, and people in communes that sometimes paired off together. Now, notably, this book fit with the liberal sexual views of the 1960s counterculture, and it also fit with some of Rogers' own developing ideas. Because eventually, as Rogers' fame as a psychologist continued to grow, his wife would face declining health. And so at one point, eventually, Rogers told his wife that he wanted to have an open marriage, and he began having extramarital sexual relationships. Now, the thing about Rogers' Becoming Partners book that is most concerning pertains to a particular case study that was presented in the book. This case study described the intimate details of a failing marriage of a couple named Natalie and Larry. And this case was actually the marriage between his daughter and his former son-in-law, who were now divorced at the time the book was written. Although Rogers altered their names and disguised a few details, they could be easily identified by those who knew them well. And the thing that is concerning about this is that he published this case study without the permission of his former son-in-law. After publication, the former son-in-law wrote Carl a letter stating that he was dismayed to have his privacy invaded without his knowledge or permission, especially given that he had since remarried and he now had a new family. Now, on one hand, this did not really break a professional confidentiality because his former son-in-law was a family member and not a client or a research participant. On the other hand, this certainly was a very insensitive thing to do. Now, it does seem that Carl Rogers was someone who was driven to gain the respect of other people and who became quite angry when people failed to show him the type of respect that he thought he deserved. One example of this comes from an incident with his brother. So at one point, Rogers' brother Lester sent in a $15 check to renew his membership at Rogers' nonprofit institute, Center for Studies of the Person. And along with his check, his brother wrote a teasing remark about the center living off of government welfare. And this is a comment that probably would have been seen by Rogers' secretaries. And this made Rogers quite angry, and he responded by writing an angry letter to his brother. And in this letter, Rogers referred to, quote, your snide and sarcastic note. And then he continued, I am enclosing $15 in cash and asking to have your name taken off our mailing list. The reason for enclosing the cash is that you can still deduct your contribution. I think it should appeal to you to be able to take $15 of tax deduction, which you don't really deserve. This note of yours really turns me off. Please expect no more communication from me, no more material from the center, and no more attempts at communication whatsoever. I am sorry for this, but it seems that communication is really impossible between us. I don't really understand what activates your hostility towards me, though I suspect it is partly jealousy or envy. I guess I will add to that a bit here. And then Rogers goes on to report some impressive sales figures from 5 of his books. And then he continues, well, I am sure that part of my motivation in citing these figures is to brag, but part of it is to say that a number of people seem to appreciate the point of view we hold here, and I'm sorry that you do not. In the last year, I have felt that I have been unreasonable in not trying to communicate something of myself to my older brother, whom I admire so much. This, however, marks the end. You will never receive material from the center again, and I can assure you that you will receive nothing from me. You will not be bothered by a brother whom you believe to be on welfare. Sometimes I feel that my bitterness about situations has increased, though my bitterness about situations is quite different from yours. But I regret for both of us if we become bitter old men. That seems like the worst fate that I can imagine. Affectionately, but finally, Carl. So that's Carl's letter to his brother. Now, one thing that may or may not be related to some of the incidents I've been describing is that at some point it appears that Carl Rogers developed alcohol dependence. Acquaintances beginning in the 1940s and for the remainder of his life would describe him as someone who drank frequently but never appeared intoxicated in a professional setting. Documents from intimate family members suggest that he had problems with drinking later in his life, in the 1970s and in the 1980s, and so it's unknown whether he had problems before then. For example, in a letter to his son David, Carl admits that over the last year, he and Helen both drink, quote, we drink a good deal, 8 to 10 drinks every 24 hours, very much spaced out through the day and night. And Carl's secretary in the 1970s, she reported that he was drinking close to a bottle of vodka every day. And around that time, both of his children wrote him letters expressing concern about his drinking and describing various symptoms that he was experiencing that they attributed to his drinking.
The soul. Now privileged fingers press the scales with ears to hear, yet unaware that the needle tilts one direction. Fingers put it there. Now privileged fingers press the scales with ears to hear, yet unaware that the needle tilts one direction. Fingers put it there. Now privileged fingers press the scales with ears to hear, yet unaware that the needle tilts one direction. Fingers put it there.
One thing that provides a good snapshot of the status of psychotherapy at the close of the decade of 1960 is the Gloria film. This is a famous psychotherapy training film, and a few images from the film are depicted on the screen. The film showed a woman named Gloria having a psychotherapy session with three of the most famous psychotherapists of the time, Carl Rogers, Albert Ellis, and Fritz Perls. The purpose of the film was to show students the differences between these three approaches to psychotherapy when the therapists are all working with the same client. And by taking note of the therapists that were included in this film, it provides information about the types of psychotherapy that were especially popular at this time. So Rogers' person-centered therapy, and Ellis's rational emotive therapy, and Perl's Gestalt therapy were all especially popular at this time in history. Note that these were all approaches that emphasized ideas that were popular in the 1960s counterculture, involving individualism and sexual liberation and rejection of cultural expectations, and doing whatever one wants regardless of what others think. Also, notably, from a modern perspective, one thing that might stand out is the fact that in the film, both the client and the psychotherapist sometimes smoked during sessions. And in light of our previous discussions regarding racism and sexism, it's notable that all the people in this film were white, and all the high-status psychotherapists were men. Toward the end of the decade of 1960, there was a new development in the types of graduate programs that provided training for clinical psychologists. As clinical psychology became a profession associated with providing psychotherapy, more and more students sought degrees in clinical psychology simply because they wanted to go into private practice and to provide psychotherapy. These students were pursuing careers purely as practitioners, and after graduate school they had little involvement in academic research. Recall that the Boulder model for clinical psychology graduate programs was called a scientist practitioner model. Students were trained both to be scientific researchers and clinical practitioners. However, many clinical psychologists were pursuing careers where they only functioned as practitioners and where they had little use for their training to conduct scientific research. So this led to discussions about the possibility of professionally oriented clinical programs. The idea was that these programs would place more emphasis on the practitioner aspect of training and less emphasis on the scientist aspect of training. An analogy was made with the degree that medical doctors get. Most medical doctors are trained to be practitioners. They are trained to use the results of scientific research in their practice, but they are not necessarily trained to become medical researchers. So, in 1968, the University of Illinois started a new program that emphasized this type of professional training and awarded a new type of doctoral degree that they called a PsyD, a PSY period D period, PsyD degree. And it was intended for students predominantly interested in practice rather than research. Then, in 1970, the Hahnemann Medical School started a professionally oriented program, also awarding the PsyD. And then in 1971, a third program, Baylor University, founded the third doctoral psychology program, awarding a PsyD degree. Notably, the PsyD program at University of Illinois only lasted until 1980, and at that point it was discontinued, in part because it was viewed as incompatible with the research focus of the university. And the Hahnemann Medical School program lasted until 1989, and at that point a rather unusual thing happened. So that program in clinical psychology was actually part of the division of psychiatry within the medical school. And over time, tensions arose between the division of psychiatry and the clinical program housed within that division. And so due to these tensions, in 1989, the entire clinical program and all its faculty left Hahnemann Medical School, and they moved to an entirely new institution at Widener University in Pennsylvania. And of those 3 programs, the Baylor program is still going and still thriving. Notably, in the last several years, it has adjusted the practitioner-scientist balance to take on a stronger emphasis on research than has been typical for other PsyD programs. And of course, I am biased because I am a faculty member at the Baylor program, but I regard the Baylor program as both a top-ranked PsyD program and the longest-standing PsyD program in the country. And so, this is where my history comes to an end. And maybe a good way to end is to consider some of the themes covered in this history. So, one theme involved the development of the scientific method and the development of statistics. And this was coupled with a related theme of people often failing to use the scientific method. And I suppose one theme was how people who do good things often also do bad things. If someone was looking for a perfect, flawless hero, I don't think my history provided any. But this might be a more realistic and authentic way of understanding the complexity of humans. And another theme had to do with power systems. When people have positions of privilege and power, they seek to justify and maintain their privilege and power, and they are often effective in doing so. And, of course, a key theme had to do with the history of racism. We saw how racism was both steeped into the history of the United States and embedded within psychology. And my hope is that we can now take this information and use it to evaluate and understand our world today, and to evaluate and understand psychology today. My hope is that by knowing this history, we will feel the tremendous importance of attending to these issues today. When we see how people in the past were complacent, my hope is that this will make us motivated and active today. For example, that we will actively look for racism and sexism, and we will actively look for the power structures that support those with privilege, and that when we look, we will be quicker to see it and quicker to recognize it. My hope is that this will make us better able to understand the experiences of all people today. At the time that I'm recording this, for example, there's been a growing Black Lives Matter movement. Yet if people fail to understand the history of racism, they may fail to appreciate the profound importance of this movement. I find for myself, at least, that the more I understand about the past, the more it widens and shapes my perspectives today. For someone such as myself, who has received the privileges associated with being white and being male, this seems especially important. But I suspect this is an important history for all people to know. So, thank you for joining me on this history of psychology, racism, and the United States.